Welcome to the seminar, Managing Concussions in Schools. Hello, I am Colleen Lorber, Executive Director of PSI's Client Services, and we are pleased so many are in attendance today. The challenges surrounding concussions and how they affect students both physically and in the educational process continue to be an issue that affect all of us. PSI staff works with hundreds of students daily in our roles as school psychologists, counselors, school health personnel, educational specialists, and speech therapists. We feel it is vitally important to support our partner schools and other educators by providing cutting-edge expertise in response to this sometimes extremely complicated problem of dealing with students with concussions. With a focus that addresses concussions on and beyond the sports field, this webinar will describe how to create and lead a school concussion management team and will provide clear, non-technical information on how concussions can affect learning, mental health, and social-emotional functioning, tools for school-based concussion assessment, and guidelines for creating accommodation plans in collaboration with the family, community, and school team. Our presenter, Susan Davies, is an associate professor and coordinator of the school psychology program at the University of Dayton. Dr. Davies previously worked as a school psychologist in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her research and professional interests include increasing educator awareness of traumatic brain injury, evaluating the efficacy of TBI interventions, and improving service delivery for students who have sustained a TBI. Dr. Davies has published a number of articles related to concussion and TBI, and she recently co-authored the book Working with TBI in Schools, Transition, Assessment, and Intervention. She lives in Ohio with her husband Alan, 3 daughters, and 3 stepsons. During this presentation, the audience will be electronically muted. If at the end you have questions, use the chat function to submit your questions. Dr. Davies will answer as many as possible in the time allotted. We are recording this presentation for those who couldn't register or attend. PSI's contact information will be on the last slide. And now, on behalf of all of us at PSI, I am pleased to present Dr. Susan Davies.
Hi, and thank you. Thank you all for spending your afternoon listening to this webinar. This is content that I'm very passionate about, and a lot of what I do in my work is spend time in schools talking with people like you about how to recognize and respond to student concussions. And we know that often students who have sustained concussions, whether it's in a sporting event, in recreation, in an accident, come back to school and may still have symptoms. And while they're symptomatic, they require some academic and environmental adjustments while their brain is going through the healing process. But most school personnel haven't received a lot of information and training in their pre-service training programs about brain injuries. So often kids come back into the classroom and teachers aren't prepared to deal with the symptoms and the academic, the social, emotional effects of some of that lingering symptomology. And sometimes the effects are transient and the student is back to feeling 100% in a couple of days. And sometimes we see children who take months to recover and have prolonged symptoms that seriously interfere with their educational performance. So the purpose of this training is to give you information on what concussions are and how they can affect all facets of students' performance, their learning, their physical health, their social emotional functioning. And then I'll share with you a suggested concussion team model. And this particular model involves having one person in the school designated as the concussion team leader. And we'll talk a little bit about who might be the best person to serve in that role. And then there are also other support personnel who have different roles and functions on that concussion team, and the student and the family are key people on that team, as are outside medical personnel who may be treating the student. And then we'll also talk about some specific strategies for getting the child back into the classroom, the return to learn. And that includes assessing their symptomology, seeing how intense their lingering symptoms still are, and then mapping their symptoms onto what might be appropriate adjustments to the learning environment. And we'll also look at some environmental kinds of modifications that can be made to the classroom, to the school environment overall, and then how we can progress monitor the recovery process so that we're not leaving adjustments and accommodations in place for an unnecessarily long period of time, so that we're getting the child back to 100% work and school functioning as quickly as possible in a really healthy way. So some of the effects that might happen in a student's concussion depend on the mechanism of injury and how severe the concussion is. And there are a lot of advocates out there for doing away with the term concussion and replacing it with mild traumatic brain injury, because that really is what a concussion is. It's a type of brain injury, and it's caused by a direct blow or jolt to the head, face, or neck, or it can be caused by a blow to the body, and it causes the head and brain to shift rapidly back and forth. So that might be in a football game. If a student athlete takes a blow to the body, their head might not receive a direct hit, but that can still result in a concussion because the brain is shaking back and forth inside of the skull cavity. And that results in short-term impairment of neurological functioning and a varying constellation of symptoms depending on the type of injury and the student. The actual prevalence of concussions is very difficult to evaluate because a lot of individuals who sustain concussions don't seek medical attention. So you may have kids who come back into your classroom and are experiencing signs and symptoms of a concussion who were never seen in the ER, who never were seen by a doctor. And because that happens so frequently, it's hard to say how many students actually are affected by concussions. And some people think, oh, if my student or my child has gone to the ER and they get a clean CT scan or MRI, then they're fine. But one of the sort of identifying features of a concussion is that we can't see them on CT scans or MRIs. Usually if you can see a brain injury on a CAT scan or MRI, that's a more severe kind of brain injury, but a concussion is really a neurometabolic kind of injury where it's the neurochemistry in the individual that's gone thrown out of whack. So it's not going to be showing up as a bleed or a bruise on the brain. And then we also have a lot of concussions that go unreported. So particularly in our student athletes, there may be student athletes who have concussion symptomology who choose to not report that concussion symptomology because they don't want to be pulled out of a game. They don't want to seem weak. They want to be tough. And so we have a lot of concussions that aren't getting medical attention, that aren't getting reported. And our children are both at increased risk of experiencing a brain injury in the first place and at having prolonged recovery when compared to adult populations. And a lot of what I want to emphasize today is that concussions aren't just experienced by athletes. So we definitely want to make sure we're paying attention to our student athletes and training them in the signs and symptoms of concussions, making sure our coaches are better trained in concussion recognition and response, but also that everyone in the school community, including parents and students, understand that concussions frequently occur from recreational accidents, falls, fights, car accidents, things like that. And this slide just summarizes a little bit of some of those neurometabolic changes that I mentioned, those neurochemical changes that take place in the brain upon injury. And what's happening at the cellular level is that potassium is flowing out of the brain cells, calcium is flowing into the brain cells, and this imbalance results in the inefficiency of those cells to properly deliver nutrients to the brain, particularly glucose. And all of these changes interfere with the student's ability to engage in typical physical or mental activities. So here is what a concussion might look like to an outside observer. So we're going to talk a little bit about signs, and then we're going to talk about symptoms. So signs are what you might see, what teachers or support personnel or parents might see in someone who has sustained a blow to the head or body, that the student appears dazed or stunned. In conversation, they may be confused about events. They may be answering questions slowly, repeating questions, have transient amnesia and difficulty recalling what happened just before or after the hip, bump, or fall. They may or may not lose consciousness. That is not a defining feature of a concussion. The vast majority of concussions do not involve a loss of consciousness, but that's definitely something that you want to be on the lookout for and include in any information that's communicated, especially to parents or doctors, whether or not there was a loss of consciousness. They may show personality or behavior changes and become forgetful in class schedule or assignments. And all of these things make sense if we go back a slide and look at how the molecular changes have hindered the physical and mental activities. Once these neurochemicals get out of balance, the brain is trying to recalibrate. It's working very hard, and so then it makes it difficult for the person to learn and remember and process information because the brain is putting lots of energy into just recovering basic neurochemical functioning. These are some danger signs. So these are things that are observed in a student who has sustained a blow to the head or body. These are things you need to watch out for and are indicators that the student should be seen in the emergency department right away. If one pupil is larger than the other, if the child becomes increasingly drowsy and cannot be awakened, if they get a headache that gets rapidly worse, weakness, numbness, or decreased coordination. There may be some vomiting or nausea immediately after the concussion, but if there's prolonged and repeated vomiting or nausea, that's a danger sign. If there's slurred speech, convulsions, or seizures, if the student has difficulty recognizing people or places, if they become increasingly confused or restless or agitated or showing unusual behavior, and if there is that loss of consciousness, even if it's brief, those are all indicators the student needs to be seen in the emergency department right away because they can be indicators of a more significant brain injury, like there may be swelling or a bleed on the brain that requires immediate medical attention. These constellations are the symptoms, and these are things that the student may be experiencing and things that they can communicate to you as an educator or to medical professionals or to their parents. And this is a lot of the basis of a concussion diagnosis because we can't see it on our typical hospital-based tests that we have now. That may change down the road as our medical technology improves, but for now, doctors are going to look a lot at that self-report of what the student is feeling. And so we've got our cognitive, our physical, our emotional, mood, and sleep symptoms. So cognitively, if the student reports feeling slowed down or sluggish, have trouble concentrating, trouble learning and remembering new information, they may have physical symptoms. And just as a side note, every concussion is different. So students may have symptoms in only one of these categories. They may have symptoms in all of them. They may have mild physical symptoms and intense cognitive symptoms. All of those constellations can look different. That first symptom, though, under physical is one of the most common concussion symptoms, and that is a headache. They may have fuzzy or blurred vision, that nausea or vomiting early on that I mentioned. Sensitivity to light or noise is quite common. They may feel off kilter and have balance problems, and overall feel lethargic and like they have little energy. The emotional mood symptoms can be kind of complex. Here you can see that the student who has had a concussion may be irritable, sad, more emotional, more nervous and anxious, and some of that's related to the physical recovery, the physical injury and the recovery from a concussion, that neurochemical imbalance is making them feel more emotional than usual. Some of it also may be related to the situation that surrounded the concussion. So if they have restrictions put on them as far as driving or playing a sport that they love or engaging with technology that they enjoy, that can also affect their emotions and their mood. And then sleep symptoms, sleeping more or less than usual or having trouble falling asleep can all be indicators of a concussion. In school, what can happen is that if a student comes back to school and they're symptomatic and they are expected to do all of the things that they've always done, those symptoms can flare. So when we challenge the brain and we're taxing the brain with difficult tasks and lengthy tests, those symptoms can flare. So when a student is just trying to push through it and tough it out, it can make symptoms worse and it can prolong recovery. So the best treatment that is recommended for now for concussion is physical and cognitive rest. And there's a lot of research and controversy related to how much physical and cognitive rest, because while we don't want students coming back full force to school and physical activity while they're symptomatic, it's also not healthy for them to stay home for a prolonged period of time in a quiet, dark room for a longer period of time than is healthy. So a lot of what I'll talk to you about today is how we can engage students in school. They can come back to school while they're still symptomatic, but not pushing them so hard, taxing their brain so much that their symptoms flare. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to achieve this balance after we go into the school-based concussion management team. This is just an illustration about the typical trajectory of recovery from a concussion, and most students will recover and no longer report symptoms within 3 to 4 weeks. As I said, sometimes it's a couple of days, sometimes it can be several months, but 80% of students will recover within 3 to 4 weeks. And students should be receiving appropriate adjustments depending on what their symptoms are until their symptoms have resolved. Some of the risk factors that can come into play and affect that recovery trajectory and lead to a longer recovery period or more intense symptoms are if that student has a developmental history of previous learning problems or attention problems, other developmental disorders. Recovery can take a bit longer for students in that category. If they have a history of migraines or headaches, those physical symptoms will often be more intense and prolonged. If there's a psychiatric history of things like anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, other psychological disorders, those facets may be intensified and recovery prolonged there as well. And then our bigger box here is certainly that concussion history. That's really important to document and track, and it's very important for our student athletes in particular to know that once a student has sustained a concussion, they're then at increased risk for sustaining another concussion. And sometimes that can occur with less force and with a longer recovery period. So there's no set numbers. You know, some people will say, okay, if they've had 3 concussions, then they're out and they shouldn't play their sport anymore. I try to avoid having such hard and fast rules because sometimes it's just that first or second concussion that is so significant and serious and the student isn't recovering for a long period of time, that may be the end point at which a student shouldn't engage in those high-risk kinds of activities anymore. You may have other students who play a sport across many number of years and have a higher number of concussions and may be able to successfully continue playing in their sport. And that's really something that requires good coaching and good medical guidance. So the return to activity plan that we will talk about is focusing primarily on that return to learn piece, because as I mentioned, students can come back to school while they are still symptomatic. And once they are back to school full force and they're able to engage without any accommodations or modifications, then we can look at that process of returning to physical activities and returning to play. But students who are symptomatic should not be resuming physical activity at all until they no longer have symptoms. So here is a bit on the recommended concussion team model, and I like to emphasize that we want this to be flexible to meet the needs of all different districts. And so we know that different districts and different schools have varying resources, and so what I've tried to piece together here is a model that can be adjusted to meet the needs of districts of differing demographics in our rural, urban, suburban districts, different grade levels, and so forth. So overall, that team model ensures that every student, no matter how old they are, who sustains a concussion is monitored for a return to activity. And one of the main benefits of it is that it can help effective communication. So we want to make sure that our school teams are communicating with each other, that teachers are talking to nurses and school psychologists and school counselors and administrators, and that there's also that good mechanism for communication from those folks back to medical personnel and to the family, and that those team members are particularly skilled at being good listeners and connecting with parents and recognizing that a brain injury is a really scary thing to go through as a student and as a parent. And we want our school-based concussion team members to be particularly skilled at focusing on solution, collaboration, and working together toward common goals. So this is a sample structure of a school-based concussion team. We've got the student and the family as key members and some suggested academic team members, like the teacher, school psychologist, school counselor, administrator, speech-language pathologist. Medical team members such as the school nurse, the athletic trainer, if it's a student-athlete situation, the student's physician, and the athletic team member. So of course that athletic trainer would be both kind of that medical and athletic team member. And so for our student athletes, the athletic team members would be the coach, the athletic director, and a PE teacher. And here is a bit of a summary on the roles and responsibilities of each of those team members. And I think it's really important that whoever is designated as the concussion team leader, that person communicate to the student that they're a key person on this team and that they need to be communicating with their parents and with their teachers about their symptoms, what academic difficulties they're having, and if they're given any assigned duties like completing a symptom checklist, that they're responsible for completing those tasks to the best of their ability. And then we want to make sure we link in with parents to provide medical information to the school. One really important thing that our concussion team leader does is to get that signed release of information so that the school can easily communicate with the medical providers. And that parent and guardian can help the student maintain compliance with medical or academic directives and recommendations to promote recovery. These are some sample roles and responsibilities of academic team members, and again, depending on the personnel and the resources, these can shift around. The teachers responsibilities are to help the student get the best education possible, to follow recommended academic adjustments, and to communicate back to the other team members which adjustments seem to be most helpful and which may need to be phased out. And at the end of the presentation, I'll go through what are some of these suggested school-based environmental academic adjustments depending on the symptoms that we're seeing in students. A school counselor can be a key person in creating and disseminating those academic or environmental adjustments to teachers. School psychologists often serve in that role as well, and can be particularly helpful in consulting in some of those complex cases where there's prolonged recovery period, perhaps where long-term adjustments or more extensive school-based assessments or educational plans become necessary. And then the administrator is really key for kind of facilitating this team process and directing the overall concussion team model and troubleshooting any problems that might arise. I really see administrators as key too in helping facilitate that culture change in a school regarding the implementation of any concussion response programs and policies. As far as our medical team members, the athletic trainer is key in helping evaluate possible injuries and making appropriate referrals for student athletes who sustain concussions. They can monitor symptoms and help coordinate the safe return to play process. Because this is a very short webinar, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the return to play process, but there's a lot of good information on the Ohio Department of Health's website for recommended return to play processes, and then communicating back to the school about the student athlete's progress. The physician would be key in evaluating, diagnosing, and managing the student's injury and to help direct medical and academic recommendations. And then the school nurse is a key resource in this whole process because they would be that in-school person who would be best positioned to monitor in-school symptoms and health status changes. And the school nurse can also help determine if it's appropriate for that injured student to be in school or if that school attendance is counterproductive, and then they can also help discern if a student needs any health-related adjustments. As far as our athletic team members, the athletic director can really be a policy director and help oversee the district's athletic department's concussion team plan, making sure our equipment is safe, that our policies are up to date, that coaches, athletes, and parents are educated in concussion recognition and response. And then coaches and PE directors would help recognize concussion symptoms, know when to remove a potentially injured player from practice or competition, and receive communication from healthcare providers and share that information back with the school about a student's progress. And I've mentioned this important person quite a bit, the concussion team leader, and this is the central communicator for all team members. There should be one designated CTL in each school to help oversee the return to learn process. They would be the person to get that signed release of medical information to allow the bidirectional communication between the school and the healthcare provider. And we don't dictate that this should always be the school nurse or it should always be the school psychologist. It really depends on the roles and responsibilities in the school. So it might be one of those people, it might be the school counselor, it might be an administrator or someone else. It's just important that the designated CTL be trained in concussion recognition and response, that they be organized and be a good communicator, willing to learn, and logistically be someone who's in the school building most days. This graphic just kind of summarizes the concussion team process that I'm going to go a bit more in depth with over the next few slides, but we really see it occurring across the 6 steps that are outlined on the left-hand side, and in the next 6 slides I'm going to go a bit more in depth with each of these steps and what the concussion team leader and team members are going to be doing at each step. So the first step, you want to make sure that everyone in the school knows that when a student sustains a concussion, that concussion is reported to the concussion team leader as soon as possible. So that individual, the leader, should be made known to teachers, coaches, parents, administrators, all responsible adults, so everyone knows who to report an injury to. Then anyone in the school community who suspects a concussion would contact that CTL right away so the student can be referred for proper evaluation. Then that CTL would also be responsible for reviewing the student's cumulative file to see if that student previously had a concussion from a previous injury. So they would be key in tracking those multiple concussion cases. The second step is that the CTL contacts the student and family to meet with the student upon return to school. So the CTL would explain the role of the concussion team manager, give contact information, go over the steps of the concussion management process, and explain those responsibilities that we already covered of the responsibilities of the student and the family, and emphasizing that importance of the honest communication, following recommendations, and so forth. And sometimes that occurs over email. It's ideal if it can be face-to-face, but sometimes it might be a phone call or an initial kind of email contact before the student comes back to school. Step number 3 is to ensure that the student's medical needs have been or are assessed. So the CTL or the CTL's designee. So say, for example, if the CTL is a school administrator, that person might designate the school nurse as the person to carry out this step, and that's fine. It depends on, that structure of the school. Again, we want the model to be flexible. So the CTL or another designated concussion team member, such as the school nurse, would determine if the student has been evaluated for a concussion by an athletic trainer or a physician or someone else, and if there is documentation from that provider concerning any recommended activity restrictions and adjustments. And sometimes that information is provided and it's great, and then the team can adopt that and move on. Sometimes there are not recommendations available, and in that case, the CTL or the designated team member should assess symptoms to determine if the student would benefit from being in school or if attendance is likely to be counterproductive. And within the next couple of weeks on the Ohio Department of Health website, a lot of these sort of supplemental materials that I'm going to be mentioning should be available for download. So there are a lot of different concussion symptom logs that you can just find out on the internet, but there will be links to a lot of these specific resources available at ODH. So if the evaluator determines that a student's symptoms are so intense and severe that that attendance in school, that they're not going to benefit at all from being at school, that they're not going to learn anything, that they're physically going to be miserable and benefit more from just going home and sleeping, then that student may need to be sent home. But if symptoms are manageable and the student is still dealing just maybe more with some sensitivity to light and noise, some transient headaches, maybe it's taking a little longer for information to sink in, some memory problems, but that learning is still able to happen, then the student can continue to the next step, continue to step 4 if the team discerns that the symptoms aren't going to become significantly worse by attending school. So all of this will be documented as far as what the symptom intensity is at that given point in time. CTL would get the signed medical release from the parent or guardian to allow that communication between the school and physician, and the CTL would start a folder for the student. The next step is assessing those academic needs, and so oftentimes the healthcare provider will send along some academic recommendation of just some simple modifications and accommodations that can happen in the classroom during the healing process. And one analogy that I really like to use is a student with a broken arm, for example, can certainly come back to school, and you would just put into place some common sense restrictions for that student. You wouldn't force them to write with their injured arm. You would, they would not be participating fully in PE class. They would have somebody help carry their books. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're looking at environmental and school-based adjustments for a student who is recovering from a concussion. So sometimes you'll have a student who has sustained such a significant physical injury that they need to stay home for a longer period of time, and then once they've recovered a bit, they can come back to school. So we want to look at these kids who have sustained concussions very similarly, and sometimes that analogy can help teachers and parents better understand this process a little bit too. So if the healthcare provider has some of these specific academic recommendations, then the designated team member or the CTL should specify those general recommendations and share them with that student's teacher or their team of teachers. But if no recommendations are available, the CTL or that designated team member, which oftentimes might be a school counselor or school psychologist, would assess the student's academic needs. And so we'll talk more about what some of those specific academic adjustments would be based on their symptoms at the end of the presentation. And then document all of this information. The CTL should also be keeping kind of a case tracking form so they know how many concussion cases they're tracking across the school year. And that's another form that's going to be up within the next couple of weeks on the ODH website. Step 5 is distributing those adjustments to the teachers in writing and also sharing them with the family and the athletic teams, such as the coaches and athletic trainer, if that's applicable. So giving them the relevant academic and medical updates and making sure that the symptom log is being used for progress monitoring. So this kind of reevaluation process is outlined in step 6. And what you want to do here is we want to make sure that there aren't academic adjustments like modified test or shortened homework. We don't want to put those in place for an unnecessarily long period of time. So anytime that new physician documentation comes in saying a new course of action should be put into place, when the symptoms have changed, if the symptoms have resolved and are no longer a barrier to school participation, or if teachers or parents identify problems in the current plan that aren't being adequately addressed, those are all times when the concussion team would reassess the medical or academic needs and look at, do we need to intensify some of these supports and adjustments, or is it time to scale them back? And sometimes that scaling back can occur very quickly, just over a period of a few days. Once that reassessment is complete that documentation, and then return to step 5, distribute any changes to that student's plan to the teachers, family, and so forth. And then just a quick note on student privacy, because anytime we have a team involved with a student and we are collaborating with parents and outside folks, we want to make sure that staff members are reminded to only discuss what's necessary to manage a given situation, and that they understand how to appropriately communicate the things that are involved in this plan in a way that maintains student privacy. So here I've just included a couple of links to direct you to, if you're looking for more information on how student health information is protected by HIPAA, how student records are protected by FERPA. And this is just a little note. Sometimes this information can be overwhelming. It's difficult to tell teachers, you need to do one more thing, and you're also going to be responsible for taking care of kids who have had concussions and monitoring their symptoms and all of that. It can seem very overwhelming. And that's one of the reasons that I really like the team model, because that responsibility is shared across educators and support personnel. So if you are taking the lead in taking this information back to your school community, I encourage you to keep it simple at first, introducing some of those key concepts and getting support for this concussion team model from responsive faculty members. I'd say some of those most responsive faculty members will likely be people who have had concussions and needed school-based support for students who were going through the process of recovering from symptoms. Creating some opportunities for discussions, maybe at a staff training or at an in-service day. Getting feedback on how this initiative can be improved for your particular district or building. And then just providing that ongoing training and professional development in a way that is easily accessible. So it might be something like a webinar like this, or you might prefer more of a face-to-face kind of model. You might share a lot of paper or web-based resources with people in your building, and then just know that any systems change takes time. And that this kind of initiative of creating a culture of caring around students who have sustained concussions can be one of those systems change initiatives that take time. So as far as the return to school progression, initially after a brain injury, it's really important to rest the brain and for that child to get a lot of good sleep. You don't want to keep waking them up through the night. That's one of those concussion myths that we want to get out of the way. Once a child is not exhibiting any of those danger signs, immediately after an injury, one of the best things they can do is get a lot of good sleep. So a commonly recommended school-based adjustment is if a student is symptomatic, they may come back to school only for partial days and have more of an opportunity to rest at home while not getting so far behind in their schoolwork. We definitely recommend that physical, emotional, and cognitive activities be limited to a level that's tolerable and doesn't cause symptoms to flare, and that if a student is staying at home, that you emphasize to that student and the parents that some of the worst things they can do is to do some of their favorite things. So a lot of the technology that our students love, computers, texting, video games, TV, loud music, especially music by headphones, those are some of the worst things that someone with a concussion can do. So to encourage that cognitive rest means to limit or avoid those kinds of activities because they can cause symptoms to flare and prolong recovery. And then again, during that time, emphasizing the need for physical rest, of not participating in physical activities until the child has been cleared by a physician. And that includes in PE classes and in sporting activities. Because if a student sustains a second concussion before the first has resolved completely, that puts that child at increased risk for more long-term effects of that concussion. This is a recommended return to academics progression that at first, after the concussion, the child have no school and almost complete cognitive and physical rest, and getting guidance from a healthcare professional regarding readiness to return to school. And it might be the next day after they've sustained their concussion, or it might not be for several days or a week. Then gradually going back to school for a partial day with adjustments put in place, and that might be like a shortened school day, lots of breaks embedded within the day. The student might go and rest in the nurse's office while the rest of the class is going to PE, then progressing to the full day with adjustments, and then withdrawing those adjustments. But still, at step 4, we emphasize no physical activity until the child's released by a healthcare professional. And then finally, going back full days with full extracurricular involvement. This just kind of summarizes the decision making that we can help walk our teachers through of how they can gradually increase cognitive demands in the classroom to an extent that it doesn't worsen symptoms. So if a teacher increases cognitive demands and it doesn't make symptoms worse, then they can gradually increase those cognitive demands, continuing to give maybe more math problems or longer reading passages or longer tests. But if we're increasing cognitive demands and it causes symptoms to worsen, we recommend that the activity be discontinued and that that student be allowed to rest for about 20 minutes. If that helps improve symptoms, great, then you can restart the activity at or below the level that produced symptoms. But if the rest does not lead to a symptom improvement and the student still has headaches or they're feeling nauseous, then to discontinue the activity and resume when symptoms have lessened, like the next day. We always recommend that some of these academic adjustments be front-loaded, that you put ample supports and services and adjustments into place initially, and then gradually withdraw them as the student is recovering. One of the things that can be the most anxiety-provoking for students is work that is piling up. So one of the greatest gifts that teachers can give a student who is recovering from a concussion is excusals from work that is deemed unnecessary. So that can be kind of a team decision of what work can we just excuse from the student from altogether and not require them to make up. Then what are some accountable assignments where we really need the student to be responsible for the content but not necessarily follow the same process as everyone else? So what might be some assignments that maybe everyone else is writing a 10-page paper but on a book that they read, but that this student could give an oral report on a book that they read? And then what are those responsible assignments that really do need to be completed by the student? So depending on what their symptoms are, if they're general, if they're cognitive, if they're physical or emotional, the next few slides illustrate some specific examples of the academic adjustments that might be recommended. So in general, that adjusted class schedule, like the shortened school day, having a late start to the day so that the student can get a longer night of sleep than usual, can be helpful. And I would say especially in some of our really early starting high schools where the kids are starting at 7:10, if that student who's had a concussion can sleep as long as they need to and start their school day a little bit later, that can be really helpful. No PE class until cleared by a healthcare professional, and no physical play at recess. And I would also emphasize we need to tend to that social emotional piece for the student. So instead of just telling the student, you can't go play at recess, coming up with an alternate activity for them, letting a friend stay in the classroom with them, or having something quiet that they can do at the side of the playground that is still fun. Allowing students to audit a class and participate, but without producing work or receiving grades might work, especially for some of our secondary students. Avoiding noisy or overstimulating environments like band class or pep rallies, especially if they cause symptoms to increase. Allowing students to drop high-level classes or certain elective classes without a penalty, particularly if adjustments go on for a long period of time. And being very careful about testing, either removing testing or limiting testing, limiting high-stakes tests or projects can be very helpful for students who are recovering from concussions, and then alternating periods of exertion, of mental exertion, with periods of mental rest. These are some suggested adjustments for cognitive and thinking symptoms. So for those kids who are having difficulty with memory or learning new information, reducing assignments and homework to only critical tasks during that recovery period, exempting non-essential written classwork or homework, and basing grades on adjusted homework, not leaving that kid with a lot of things to catch up on. Providing extended time for assignments and tests, adjusting due dates. Once a key learning objective has been presenting, reducing repetition to maximize that student's cognitive stamina, so maybe having them do fewer math problems, letting them have alternate ways of demonstrating their understanding of material. Again, for example, like allowing them to do something orally instead of in writing, I'd say especially instead of in writing on the computer. Writing things down for the students so they don't have to hold so much information in their head, so giving them written instructions for essential work, giving them notes or providing them with a peer's notes, and then allowing the use of a computer, smartphone, or tape recorder if that use of technology is not something that exacerbates that particular student's symptoms, and then allowing the use of notes for test taking so that we're not relying so much on memory and cognitively taxing tasks. For students with physical and fatigue symptoms, allowing them to visit the nurse or counselor if they have headaches or other symptoms, giving them those strategic rest breaks during the day, giving them time to pass in the hall before or after the crowds have cleared, again, just like you would do for a student with a broken leg. For students with light sensitivity, allowing them to wear sunglasses indoors or drawing the blinds in a bright and sunny classroom, allowing them to sit away from the window, giving them a quiet, less stimulating, less noisy place to work, giving them an alternate, again, more quiet, less noisy place to have their lunch, let a friend join them, and giving them a quiet environment for taking tests. And then for our students who have those emotional symptoms, anxiety, depression, irritability, give them a plan so that student can discreetly leave the classroom as needed for breaks. Figuring out a way to keep them engaged and involved in extracurricular activities, so they might not be able to go full force at lacrosse practice or football or soccer practice, but giving them ways that they can still be connected with their teammates and maybe even attend some of those events but not fully participate in the practice. Giving the student just a quiet place for de-stimulation at school, giving suggestions for other activities that are non-physical in nature, maybe things that are more oriented to art or service, and then helping create a school-based emotional support plan, really drawing on those skills of your school psychs and your school counselors, and identifying an adult like one of those people to connect that student with if they are starting to feel overwhelmed. And even with the best laid plans, even if your school and your team is doing all of these things perfectly, you may still have cases of symptoms not resolving. So if they are managed appropriately, we would expect in most cases that symptoms would resolve in a few weeks, but for students with persisting problems, there may be academic accommodations and student support provided through a more formalized plan, a 504 plan, or in very rare cases, an IEP for a traumatic brain injury. And one question that often comes up when I do these kinds of presentations is, what do we do about students who are feigning their symptoms because they want to continue receiving those academic adjustments? They like having shortened tests and they like having the longer extended due dates for assignments. And really what I have found is that that is rare. But that is another benefit of the team-based approach. And so in those kinds of cases, we recommend that the team meet to collaboratively determine next steps. And often, if it's a situation where the restrictions are being implemented across the board. If there's a student who is getting academic adjustments at school and their symptoms are still so intense, then they should also not be doing a whole lot extracurricular-wise at home. And so if we can really get buy-in from the parents of saying, okay, well, if the student really needs so many adjustments at school, then during their time at home, they really should be laying low. So like not running around with their friends, not playing out in the neighborhood, not going to the movies, and things like that. So sometimes those more widespread restrictions can help eliminate these cases of exaggerating or feigning symptoms. This is just a little bit of a summary on how we would recommend progress monitoring. The use of the concussion symptom log, and that tracking on a 0 to 6 scale of how bad symptoms are is a pretty common tool that's used. That's one of those tools that is pretty widely available on the internet, and the team can discern if we want the student to do symptom ratings on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to help determine which academic adjustments we can scale back on. And then just kind of tracking how those academic adjustments are going. So asking the students some open-ended questions like, how's Spanish class going, to clarify if there are specific courses or certain tasks that are continuing to present difficulty. And maybe adjustments only need to be put into place in a couple of subjects, not necessarily in all classes, depending on the course content, the type of homework and schoolwork and testing that's being required. And then as those symptoms improve, gradually increasing either the amount of work or the length of time spent on work or the type or difficulty of the work. And then after all of those steps are finished and the student is able to be back at school with no accommodations in place anymore and symptoms aren't getting worse with more taxing cognitive tasks, then you can follow those return to play guidelines. And the general return to play guidelines dictate that a healthcare professional's clearance needs to be obtained in order for a student to return to play. To sports practice and athletic games after sustaining a concussion. And that healthcare professional needs to be a professional with expertise in concussion evaluation and care. And failure to follow that guideline can really put a student at risk and increase the risk of neuroinflammation, and that can become chronic and really lead to permanent problems, long-term headaches, things like that. And then it's recommended that a student can return to play when they're symptom-free, both at rest and with exertion, with no medication, and back to baseline on academics. And if any neurocognitive tests like IMPACT are available, recommending that they be back to baseline on that as well. And then this is just a summary of the 6-step return to play model, and students gradually increasing the amount of physical exertion they can have. And again, more information on return to play is available on the Ohio Department of Health website. And then this is just some guidelines on, well, what do you do with all of this information? You've sat here and listened to me talk for an hour. What do you do now? So my recommendation would be to make sure that there is a designated concussion team leader at your school, and maybe that is you, that you help facilitate the creation of a culture in your school that encourages the reporting of known and suspected concussions, especially among your student-athlete population, that you share information with all students and parents and school staff about the things we've talked about today, how concussions can affect learning, how doing the right thing in managing a concussion can decrease the likelihood of prolonged health or academic problems. And these links are a couple of really good resources. This Brain 101 link has a good video that can be shared with students or maybe in a teacher training, and it's just a 15-minute summary of what is a concussion and why you need to report it and what repercussions can happen if a child kind of tries to push through a concussion. And then the Centers for Disease Control has all kinds of fabulous resources for schools that can be customized for your schools, handouts for parents and teachers and nurses and counselors, checklists, rating scales, all kinds of really good stuff. Make sure that your school procedures are aligned with the school-based concussion management plan, and make sure that everyone who is designated on that concussion team have a written guide of what their individual role entails in terms of their responsibilities and expectations. All right, and I'll turn it over to the moderators. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davies. We hope you found this webinar useful, and we hope that you will participate in future PSI webinars. At the completion of the webinar, you will immediately receive a survey. If you attended the webinar in its entirety and submit a completed survey, you will receive a certificate of attendance from PSI. Please allow at least a week before expecting your certificate that will be emailed to you. If you have any questions or would like additional information on any PSI service, our contact information is on the final screen. Thank you very much.